Um, I want you to see how even those who we would consider great disciples of the faith, I want you to see how those great disciples see the great need of Jesus and how Jesus meets them. Okay, that's what I want you to see. But I want you to see that because I think it's pretty clear here in as if we consider John the Baptist. But also want you to see who we believe wrote this book, Mark, and I want you to also see who's behind this book, Peter, the Apostle Peter. So we're going to look at Mark, we're going to look at Peter, we're going to look at John the Baptist. Okay. So first, Mark. Who is Mark? Who's this gospel attributed to? Oddly enough, not only Mark, but none of the gospel writers tell us, hey, I wrote this book, signed Mark, Matthew, John, Luke. None of them tell us that. One person said it's almost as though the gospel writers themselves are telling us, my name doesn't deserve to be on this text that bears witness and speaks of the glory of God in the incarnation of Jesus. None of them identify who their authors were. But early, very early, and very widely, this text is attributed to Mark. And Mark is also known in the New Testament as John Mark, who is the son of Mary. Now, we're told that in Acts chapter 12, and we're told that actually in the context of what happens to Peter and him getting out of prison. You see, Mary actually was the one who owned this house where the early Christians in Jerusalem would gather together for prayer and for worship. And when Peter was released from prison, when he was kind of gotten out of prison, not really released, he went there to the house of Mary, the mother of Mark, who's also known as John Mark. And so anyway, we have a sense there pretty early on that this author here, Mark, would have been well known, or he would have known those associated with the way of Jesus. Very likely, if Mary was there early on in Jerusalem, housing the disciples, she probably would have been one of those who was following Jesus whenever she could. And she probably would have brought along her son to listen to him, to see him work the marvels that he worked, and to learn about him. It's very likely that Mark's mother was very devout, and she was very central to the worshiping community there in Jerusalem in the early ministry in Acts. Anyway, we don't know that necessarily all of that, but the church has widely agreed that that is the Mark that wrote this text. There's a couple things that are interesting about that Mark, and again, we don't know this entirely for certain. But we believe, many people have believed for a while, that Mark actually puts himself in the story without naming himself. And it's in this odd sort of detail. Maybe you remember this story. So Jesus is arrested, right, at the end of his ministry, there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Mark tells a detail after his arrest that nobody knows why it's there. We don't understand what the point is. It's just this odd detail, and we think that he's saying, hey, I was there, I saw it, and I'm giving you this detail because even though it doesn't make sense in the story necessarily, this was my story. And this is what we read in Mark chapter 14, verses 51 and 52. It's sort of Mark's signature. And a young man followed him, that's Jesus, with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, the young man. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. That's the story. And nobody knows, why is that story there? But we think it may be that that's Mark's signature. This was me. And the people around him that maybe heard the text are like, oh yeah, I've heard Mark tell that story. Pretty funny, right? Like he ran away naked. He's been telling that one for a while. But what's interesting too is this is such a humbling story. This is a humble story, a cowardly story. He's running away when Jesus, his Lord, needed him. When he's being arrested, here's a story of a young man who doesn't have sort of the courage to follow his Lord then. Very humble story to tell. Here's a disciple of Jesus. Here's one who follows the way of the Lord, right? But he's also a cowardly young man. A man writing this account of Jesus, not to draw attention to himself, but to show the glory of God in Christ. Here is a disciple, not one that's always saying, look at me, but he's saying, look at my Lord. If this story is true, if that is Mark, as people have said, it also links up with another thing that we know about this Mark in the book of Acts. John Mark, that Mark there, goes on the first missionary journey with Paul and with Barnabas. And you might know that that's the shortest of the missionary journeys. This is what we read in Acts chapter 13, verse 13. Now, Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John, that's John Mark, left them and returned to Jerusalem. That's a small little detail, and you might know actually that that kind of the conflict that was there made a bigger conflict between Barnabas and Paul and whatnot. But one of the things I want you to hear is, if you're noticing actually the story and where they are going, and you know the whole journey, what you know is that John Mark doesn't make it halfway through the shortest missionary journey that Paul does. And he hightails it home. Like, this is too rough. This is too difficult. I need to go home to my mom in Jerusalem. Wimps out in Perga, heads to the comforts of home. Mark is not the hardiest soul. And of course, there's a few interesting things that we learn here, okay, as I tell you about Mark, okay. One of the things I want you to hear is that Mark was very connected to the apostolic community. He almost certainly spent time with Jesus in his earthly life, Jesus' earthly life. We don't know that for certain, but we believe that. But the other thing I want you to hear, beyond the fact that this can be believed, right? He's writing a trustworthy account, but that he doesn't remotely have it all together. Not even close. The few stories that we have of him do not make us want to sort of lift him up on a pedestal. Here is an ideal Christian. But these are the disciples of Jesus. These are the people that Jesus calls his own.